I am going to talk to you today about wind-resilient, Florida-friendly landscape design and management. And I would say this topic has probably come from the number of phone calls that I receive. People call me all the time asking for advice on plants and trees, what to plant, what not to plant. And in general, I would say people are looking for this magic list of trees that are completely able to stand up to hurricanes. And I'm sure you deal with your customers, you get that all the time too. So it's not necessarily attached to a species of tree, but more about the way that you design your landscape and manage it. And that's where I came up with this topic. This is why we care. This is down in Broward County, but this used to be, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Is that Fig Tree Lane?
Yes, it is. Can you see okay now?
What an absolute heartbreaker.
Yes.
There.
Yeah, this used to be one of the most heavily canopied streets that I was aware of in Broward County, and it was beautiful, and there was a very big loss back in the mid-2000s. So this is why when we're going forward, as I mentioned earlier, we're so lucky that we haven't in the past couple of years had much damage and very few weather-related losses. But we want to avoid this. It makes the area much hotter. We lose the shade, the environmental benefits, and the aesthetics of the larger canopy trees. As I mentioned, it's very important to remember that there's really no magic list of hurricane-proof trees. And really what it comes down to is properly planted, properly managed, healthy trees. That's the closest thing to a hurricane-proof tree. I love to share this article that came out. You all remember the big tsunami from a couple years ago, how devastating that was. There's a little town, a little village in India, and they wanted to break a world record for tree planting, and this was, I believe, 2 years before the tsunami came through. So they planted over 80,000 saplings to break this record, about 2 years before the tsunami. And it's a coastal village, and when the storm came through, they had very, very few deaths and very, very little property damage compared to some of the neighboring towns. I mean, we heard how just villages and towns were just completely destroyed. So I like to share this. There's you can find it online. It's Tsunami Villagers Give Thanks to Trees, but there's a quote in there from one of the villagers. "We were saved by these trees. Other coastal villages should also create tree cover for their safety." And I like to share this with customers and clients because if planted properly, the trees aren't the enemy, and many people, as you know, are very scared of larger trees in storms, but they can actually provide protection for you, your property, and your house. So something to keep in mind. These are the main principles that go into getting the closest thing to a hurricane-proof tree. Choosing the right tree for the right place, that's very important. Whether you're talking about trying to keep your trees resistant to wind damage, or if you want them to be resistant to pests and diseases, it all comes down to planting the right tree in the right place. Choosing appropriate species, I don't like to get really into a list of species. There are some studies that have come out that have shown, especially some of the natives that we have tend to stand up to winds better, but even the most preferred native trees that you'll see, if it's planted in the wrong place or it's not cared for properly or if it's not healthy, it's very likely to fail in a storm. So keep that in mind. And I'll tell you about in designing your landscape, trees planted in groups tend to withstand heavy winds and storm events much better than trees that are planted as individual specimens. If you can, use planting strips instead of small islands. That kind of goes along with the grouping concept. Plant trees with good quality structure when they go in, and keep them that way, keep them healthy, and maintain a strong, sound structure throughout their lives. If you follow these principles, you will get the closest thing to a storm-proof tree. So the right tree for the right place. You want to plan to avoid conflict between trees and hardscapes. I've done hurricane response for cities and had to go through and decide whether to keep or get rid of trees that were damaged in the storm. So I've seen a lot of storm damage, as I'm sure you all have as well. But we tend to see the same things over and over again, but the trees that are planted in the wrong place, that come into conflict with hardscapes, they're planted too close to a building, that's often something that will fail. You want to match the planting space to the full size of the tree. So when you're picking out the species that you want to plant, be familiar with how tall it's going to get, how wide it's going to get, and how much root space that it needs. So consider every direction that it's going to grow. If you remember after the hurricanes, you know all those little islands that have maybe an oak tree in it, that it's really not where an oak tree should have been. Well, there's not enough space for those root systems to grow. The top keeps getting bigger, but the root system stays the same size. So in a wind event, we saw so many of these trees go over, and it's almost like something popping out of a Jell-O mold. You know, you see the roots have filled up the space, there's nowhere else to go. That's not the best tree for that location. Always locate your utilities above ground and below ground, and be aware of if there's going to be any conflicts. Try and avoid them before you plant the tree. And consider everything, your buildings, your lights, your driveways, sidewalks, and that's what's in existence now, as well as what you might want to plant or to install in the future. I have a couple pictures in here of trees that I've come across throughout the years that were the wrong tree for the wrong place. Here's an example. You could see this ficus tree was planted pretty much right on top of the road. So you could see right here, the trunk was right up against the road. It had maybe a foot to grow. And on the other side, there was plenty of room, so it was kind of a one-sided root system. So of course, it was one of the first trees to fail. It's a classic example of planting a very large canopy tree that just doesn't have enough room to grow the root system that it needs, so very likely to fail. And here's a failure to consider your utility lines above the tree. When you plant it and it's 8 or 10 feet tall, it's kind of hard to think this far forward and think about what's going to happen. But this tree has very poor structure. It's not going to do well in even the tiniest bit of wind. And planning for future hardscapes. This was the wrong tree. Maybe they didn't know what they were going to do on this property in the future, but they came in and installed a curb. I don't think that's even 6 inches from this tree. You can see they actually cut into the trunk. And think about the root system. There's nothing there. In a wind event, it's going to fail. It's going to fall the opposite direction away from the curb. And just definitely the wrong tree for this location. Maybe at one time it was the right tree, but in a case like this, it probably would have been better to just remove it. I think this is from that same property. If you look how much of that root system they cut out to put whatever type of utility this is in, they took about half the root system, and it's going to fail, more than likely. Choose appropriate wind-resilient species, and take this one with a grain of salt. Any tree that you plant, if it's in the right place and it's cared for properly, is better than one of the more recommended trees if it's not cared for. But I took, there's quite a few lists, and UF has done some studies, but some of the more common ones that are recommended are the natives that we like to use anyway, but your oak trees, bald cypress, gumbo limbo, a lot of the natives that tend to do well here also happen to in these studies be found to be fairly wind resistant. And palm trees, of course, do really well. They're typically from native to islands where there are a lot of tropical storms, so it makes sense that they do well. Another design recommendation as far as wind resilient landscape design is planting in groups. We see over and over again that trees are a lot less likely to fail when they're in groups as opposed to when they're planted as specimen trees. 5 or more trees is considered a group, but certainly 3 trees is better than planting one on its own. And not just trees. When they talk about planting in groups, add understory plantings as well. Anything from grasses up to shrubs, up to your smaller understory trees, and then your big canopy trees. The more diversity and the more of a group that you plant, the better. This reduces the amount of the tree that's exposed directly to the wind. They're basically huddling together. It kind of creates a sheltering effect, and this can be beneficial to your property. If you have groups of trees, it can protect your home and your other landscape features. This is one from a couple years ago, and it failed, and there may be many reasons that this tree failed, but this was a very large canopy tree that was planted as a single specimen, kind of out in the middle of nowhere. So when the wind came in, there was nothing really to buffer it, just this one tree, and it kind of took the brunt of this wind. Groupings resist failure. This is a nice example. They could plant some more understory plants here, but here's some large canopy trees that are planted in a group as opposed to out on their own. And this is a nice parking lot planting. Instead of having a lot of really tiny islands, they've made the planting spaces bigger and also planted in groups. So I would expect these trees to do a lot better than single trees planted on their own. And also, when you're doing your landscape planning and design, you want to plant for diversity. And diversity in the landscape makes it stronger for many reasons. And it not only will make the landscape a little more wind resistant, but will also make it more resistant to pests and diseases. So just a good rule of thumb in general. Different species, different types of plants grow and mature at different rates. So it's really good to have all sorts of different ages in your landscape. Have some younger trees, some larger trees. We know that the trees do not live forever. They will die at some point, whether they fail from a hurricane and need to be removed, they die of a disease, or they die of old age. If you keep a lot of different ages in the landscape, then the smaller ones will keep growing and the older ones will eventually be phased out for one reason or another. If everything is all the same age, they're likely to come out at about the same time and leave you with very little. So consider planting diverse sizes, all sorts of different species and different ages of plants to keep the diversity. And it minimizes the risks associated with any monoculture. As far as from a disease perspective, say you have 10 oaks on a property and some disease comes in that attacks oaks, whatever it would be, and you're left with nothing once that comes through. If you have 10 different species of tree and only one of them is an oak, you only lose one tree when that disease hits here. So good to keep things diverse, and it really reduces the chance of losing everything in your landscape.